In the summer of 1683, the earth across the eastern frontiers of Europe trembled under the weight of the ultimate war machine. This was not merely an army. It was a mobile city, a tidal wave of human ambition drawn from 3 continents, marching under the sacred green banner of the Prophet. For more than 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had operated as a relentless, expanding engine of conquest. They had swallowed Constantinople, absorbed the Balkans, shattered the kingdoms of the East, and turned the Black Sea into an internal lake. Now, that immense engine was being fueled for its most audacious strike yet. At its head rode Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man whose ambition was matched only by his absolute authority. His Sultan, Mehmed IV, preferred the quiet isolation of the hunt, leaving the empire's vast military apparatus in the hands of his vizier. Kara Mustafa did not just want another border skirmish. He wanted a victory that would eclipse the greatest sultans of the past. He wanted to march where even Suleiman the Magnificent had failed. He wanted Vienna. Vienna was the bottleneck of the continent. It was the golden gateway to the heart of Catholic Europe, and beyond it lay the ultimate prize of Rome. To take it meant rewriting the map of the world forever. To achieve this, the vizier assembled a host that defied 17th century comprehension. Modern estimates place the force at up to 170,000 men. Regiments poured in from the deserts of Syria and the highlands of Anatolia. Egyptian Mamluks rode alongside the fiercely independent cavalry of the Crimean Tatars. Artillery trains, dragging massive siege guns, churned the roads into mud. Behind the fighting men trailed a sprawling logistical tale of armorers, merchants, engineers, and tens of thousands of camels, horses, and oxen. They did not just march, they consumed the landscape. When this colossal force finally crossed into Austrian territory, it carried the sheer, terrifying momentum of inevitability. As the Ottoman vanguard pierced deep into Lower Austria, the countryside was engulfed in ash. The Crimean Tatar cavalry raced miles ahead of the main column, executing a systematic campaign of terror. Villages were torched, crops were trampled into the earth, and those who could not flee westward were slaughtered or chained for the slave markets. The glow of burning horizons reached Vienna long before the first Turkish banners appeared. Panic seized the Austrian capital. Emperor Leopold I, recognizing that his standing field army was entirely incapable of meeting the Ottoman juggernaut in open battle, fled the city with his entire royal court. The wealthiest nobles and merchants followed his carriages westward, leaving the capital seemingly hollowed out, abandoned to its fate. But Vienna was not empty. Left behind were the common citizens, the city militia, and a hardened garrison of regular soldiers. Command of this desperate defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a scarred, veteran tactician who possessed an iron will and a cold understanding of siege warfare. Starhemberg took stock of his grim reality. He commanded roughly 11,000 regular troops and 5,000 armed civilians, 16,000 men standing in the path of 170,000. He immediately ordered the scorched earth destruction of Vienna's own suburbs, burning down homes and businesses outside the walls to deny the approaching enemy any cover. Food, cast iron cannonballs, and raw gunpowder were stockpiled. By mid-July, the Ottoman host arrived. The sight from Vienna's walls was paralyzing. The Turkish encampment did not look like a military bivouac. It looked like a thriving, permanent metropolis. It stretched out to the absolute limits of the horizon, a sea of canvas and silk. At its center stood the Grand Vizier's personal quarters, a multi-room palace woven from crimson and green silk, complete with courtyard gardens, exotic animals, and a harem. It was a deliberate, psychological display of overwhelming wealth and absolute confidence. Kara Mustafa sent a chilling ultimatum to the walls, promising mercy for surrender and utter annihilation for resistance. The Austrians answered with silence. The greatest siege of the 17th century had begun. The initial phase of the siege was a deafening storm of iron and fire. Ottoman batteries, shrouded in the thick white smoke of their own black powder, opened a relentless bombardment against the city. They targeted the defensive platforms, seeking to dismount the Austrian guns and slaughter the artillery crews. Vienna's gunners fired back with desperate precision, pouring water over their red-hot cannon barrels to keep them from bursting apart. The sky was torn by the high arcing trajectories of Ottoman mortars, lobbing explosive iron shells and incendiary bombs directly over the walls and onto the wooden rooftops of the city. Fire brigades raced through the narrow streets day and night, wielding hooks and buckets of water to beat back the flames. Yet, Despite the staggering volume of fire, the massive Ottoman cannons could not simply shatter Vienna's walls. This was because Vienna was protected by the pinnacle of 17th century military engineering, the Trace Italienne, or the Star Fortress. Centuries earlier, flat, towering medieval walls had been rendered completely obsolete by gunpowder. In their place, engineers had designed a system built on complex geometry. Vienna's walls were relatively low to the ground and heavily sloped. When a massive iron cannonball struck this inclined surface, it did not shatter the stone. It glanced off. Its kinetic energy deflected harmlessly upward. Projecting outward from these walls were massive, angular bastions. These jutting points ensured that there were absolutely no blind spots, no dead zones where attackers could hide. Any infantry attempting a direct charge would be caught in overlapping fields of crossfire, shredded by grape shot and musket volleys from 3 different directions at once. Furthermore, the approaches to the main walls were shielded by Ravelin's triangular fortifications placed in the moat that absorbed the brunt of an assault, acting as brutal killing zones. Kara Mustafa's engineers quickly recognized the cold mathematical reality of the Star Fortress. The geometry of the bastions made a frontal infantry assault mass suicide. The high-angle mortar fire caused terror in the streets, but it could not drop the heavily packed earth and stone of the defenses. If the walls could not be battered down from the outside, the Ottoman war machine would have to go beneath them. Under the suffocating cover of their artillery, thousands of Turkish laborers began to dig. They carved narrow, deep trenches into the earth, creeping toward the city in sharp, zigzagging angles. This geometry prevented the Austrian gunners on the walls from firing a cannonball straight down the length of the ditch. Step by agonizing step, moving mostly under the cover of darkness, the Ottoman trenches crawled like a network of veins toward the palisades. The Viennese garrison did not wait passively. At dawn, Austrian raiding parties surged out of the city gates, crashing into the forward trenches. In the cramped, muddy confines of the ditches, 17th century warfare devolved into primitive butchery. Pistols were discharged at point-blank range. Men hacked at each other with cleavers, heavy axes, and the brass-bound butts of empty muskets. The defenders would slaughter the shock diggers, collapse a section of the trench, and sprint back to the safety of the walls before the elite Janissary reserves could respond. But as the zigzag trenches pushed closer, the Ottoman counterfire grew devastating. By August, the zigzag trenches finally reached the outer limits of Vienna's defenses. Here, at the very foot of the fortress, the Ottomans dug a massive parallel trench, a long fortified ditch running parallel to the city walls. This became the staging ground. Infantry packed into the earthen corridor. Artillery was dragged forward to fire at point-blank range. From this parallel line, the true nightmare of the siege began. The Ottoman miners, the sappers, went underground. Working by the flickering, oxygen-starved light of oil lamps, Turkish engineers carved tunnels straight toward the foundations of the bastions. They shored up the earthen ceilings with heavy timber and hauled away the dirt in baskets. Their objective was brutal and simple. Dig directly beneath the massive stone walls, pack an underground chamber with hundreds of barrels of black powder, seal the tunnel tightly behind them to direct the blast outward, and ignite the fuse. Above ground, the defenders could hear the muffled, terrifying rhythm of pickaxes echoing through the stone beneath their boots. Tabe. Starhemberg ordered his own miners to dig counter-tunnels. Deep in the pitch-black earth, the two sides hunted each other by sound. When an Austrian counter-tunnel breached an Ottoman gallery, the violence was absolute. In the cramped, suffocating darkness, illuminated only by trembling flames, men fought to the death with shovels, picks, and knives. The air filled with choking dust and the deafening roar of confined pistol shots. Often, the Austrians managed to detonate small countercharges, collapsing the roof and burying the Ottoman sappers alive. But the Turkish engineering machine was too vast, and the digging was relentless. On the 12th of August, the earth heaved. A tremendous explosion ripped upward, throwing tons of soil, stone, and shattered timber into the sky. Half the city shook as the shockwave rolled through the streets. The blast annihilated a section of the forward defenses, leaving a sloping mound of rubble. Immediately, the Janissaries, the Sultan's fearless, fanatical elite infantry, surged from the trenches and scrambled up the debris. The defenders met them at the crest with a wall of musket fire and a shower of iron hand grenades, repelling the assault in a storm of blood and smoke. Yet the explosions continued. Throughout late August and into September, the outer defenses were systematically blown apart. The Ottomans were methodically dismantling the Star Fortress piece by piece. Inside the city, the situation had descended into absolute horror. It was not just the relentless bombardment or the terrifying underground detonations that were killing the defenders. It was the environment itself. The summer heat was oppressive. The city's water supply became contaminated. Mounds of unburied corpses lay in the rubble. Dysentery swept through the garrison and the civilian population, claiming far more lives than Turkish lead. Starhemberg himself fell severely ill, yet he continued to command, leaning heavily on his officers. The garrison was shrinking rapidly. The 16,000 men who had manned the walls in July had been whittled down to barely 2,000 combat-effective soldiers. Men were so physically and mentally exhausted that they collapsed at their posts, falling asleep amid the deafening roar of artillery. Desperation bred ruthlessness. Starhemberg issued a draconian decree. Any soldier found sleeping on guard duty would be summarily executed. There was no margin for human frailty. The walls were breaking, the men were dying, and the Ottoman parallel trenches were now pushing directly against the inner bastions. As September began, the geometry of the fortress finally failed. Massive Ottoman mines detonated directly beneath the main bastion walls, blowing two enormous breaches into the primary line of defense. The physical barrier between the city and the 170,000 attackers was suddenly reduced to a pile of shattered stone roughly 30 feet wide. The Janissaries poured into the gaps. Starhemberg personally directed the defense, rushing his last exhausted reserves to the breaches. Cannons were dragged to the very edge of the rubble and loaded with lethal grape shot. As the assault columns charged, the Austrian guns fired at point-blank range, turning the narrow breaches into meat grinders. The Janissaries threw themselves into the fire with terrifying discipline, engaging in savage hand-to-hand combat over the ruined masonry. Knowing the walls could not hold another massive blast, the Viennese began digging a ditch inside their own city streets, right behind the shattered walls. They piled the excavated dirt into a new embankment and drove sharpened stakes into the crest. If the bastions fell, the attackers would tumble into this inner trench and face a second desperate barricade. This wooden palisade was the absolute final line. If it broke, Vienna would burn. The city was entirely cut off from the outside world. The Ottomans maintained a double ring of outposts, executing anyone caught trying to slip through. 12 messengers had already been captured, tortured, and killed. The communication blackout was suffocating. Into this void stepped Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a Polish merchant living in Vienna who had spent years in Ottoman lands and spoke Turkish flawlessly. Disguised in Ottoman robes, Kulczycki and his servants slipped through the shattered walls under the cover of a night sortie. For days, they walked straight through the heart of the terrifyingly vast enemy encampment. Kulczycki sang Turkish folk songs, brazenly joked with sentries, and even sat at a Turkish officer's campfire, eating pilaf while spinning lies about a hometown in Anatolia. It was a high-stakes psychological tightrope, walking past the silk tents and the roaring siege batteries, entirely surrounded by the enemy. Meanwhile, night after night, the desperate defenders fired signal rockets from the towering spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral. They were screams of light fired into the dark, begging for a rescue that seemed impossible. For days, the sky remained agonizingly empty. Beneath the rubble, the Ottoman sappers were preparing the final, decisive blow. They had excavated a massive subterranean chamber directly beneath the remaining fortifications and were packing it with an unprecedented quantity of black powder. One spark, and the entire front of the city would cease to exist. The countdown was in its final hours. At dawn on the 12th of September, a single signal rocket flared high above the densely forested slopes of the Vienna woods. Help had finally come. A massive, unified Christian army, forged by the diplomatic pressure and financial backing of Pope Innocent VII, had achieved the impossible. Under the supreme command of King John III Sobieski of Poland, an allied force of 70,000 Austrians, Germans, Bavarians, and Poles had hauled their artillery and horses through the steep, rain-soaked ravines of the foothills. They now stood on the ridgeline, looking down at the sprawling, canvas city of the Ottomans. Kara Mustafa was caught entirely off guard. Blinded by his obsession with the city walls, he had failed to fortify his rear against the forested heights. He hastily ordered his artillery to turn around and rushed his infantry up the slopes to meet the threat, but he arrogantly left his elite Janissaries in the trenches to finish off Vienna. Throughout the morning and afternoon, the Allied infantry engaged in a grueling, bloody push down the steep hillsides, tearing gaps in the Turkish lines with plunging artillery fire. By late afternoon, the Ottomans had been forced off the rugged slopes and pushed down onto the flat, open ground of the plain. The terrain was finally clear. The board was set. On the right wing of the Allied line stood the heavy cavalry of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While the rest of Europe had largely abandoned heavy, lance-armed shock cavalry in favor of lighter, firearm-equipped riders, the Poles had perfected the ancient art of the armored charge. These were the Winged Hussars. They rode specially bred Tatar horses that possessed incredible stamina and explosive acceleration. The riders were encased in heavy, gilded armor, draped in the pelts of leopards and wolves. Clutched in their fists were hollow, 5-meter wooden lances, specifically designed to be longer than any infantry pike on the battlefield. Arching from their backs were massive wooden frames lined with eagle feathers. King Sobieski lowered his lance. Across a front stretching nearly 4 miles, 18,000 Allied cavalrymen, spearheaded by the 3,000 Winged Hussars, spurred their horses forward. It remains the largest cavalry charge in human history. The physics of the impact were apocalyptic. The charge began at a heavy trot, the ground beginning to shudder under the weight of 70,000 hooves. As they picked up speed, the wind caught the feathers on the hussars' backs, creating a terrifying, synchronized howling sound that panicked the enemy horses and shattered the nerves of the infantry. The Ottomans managed to fire a frantic, ragged volley of muskets and cannons. Then, the avalanche of iron struck. At 40 kilometers an hour, the kinetic mass of the heavily armored hussars slammed into the static Ottoman lines. The 5-meter lances shattered upon impact, piercing straight through ranks of men. The sheer physical momentum of the horses trampled the defensive formations into the bloody mud. Drawing their heavy sabers, the hussars carved a path of absolute destruction deep into the heart of the Turkish army. The Ottoman war machine, built for methodical siege engineering, instantly disintegrated under the raw kinetic shock. The collapse was total. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, realizing his grand ambition had just been vaporized in a matter of minutes, fled the battlefield, leaving behind the greatest logistical train ever assembled. By nightfall, the starving defenders of Vienna wandered out of their ruined city and into an eerie, abandoned wonderland. The vast Ottoman encampment was empty. The victors found thousands of transport wagons, herds of cattle, and the vizier's opulent, cathedral-sized silk tent, complete with Persian carpets and abandoned correspondence. Amid the unimaginable wealth left behind, they discovered hundreds of sacks filled with strange, dark beans. These sacks were given to the spy Kolchitsky as a reward for his bravery. He used them to open one of the very first coffee houses in Vienna, forever changing the culinary culture of the continent. The victory at Vienna did not just save a city, it fundamentally altered the geopolitical axis of the world. It birthed the Holy League, a permanent coalition that would continuously drive the Ottomans out of Central Europe. For Kara Mustafa, there was no redemption. Months later, deep in Ottoman territory, the Sultan's messengers arrived. Following imperial tradition for a man of his high station, he was granted a bloodless death. He knelt, offered his final prayers, and a thick silk cord was pulled tight around his neck. The era of Ottoman expansion was over.